Good to see you all, or see you. I don't see Róisín.
I'm here. Can you
You're
hear
there?
me okay?
Okay. Oh, I see you now. Yeah, good to see you.
Hello.
Yeah, how are you?
I'm pretty good. I'm in Dublin. Civilization is returning, can't complain.
Yeah. As you know, I really love this book a lot. And we've talked about it a bit before, but yeah, it's quite exciting to get to talk to you about it in a more kind of formal way in front of some people, in a situation where you have to answer my questions. So, the first question I wanted to ask you about is, I'm really curious about the sort of, because this feels to me like a book that you were sort of meant to write. When I heard about the fact that you were writing this book when you were writing it, and I just thought, yes, that's the perfect book for Róisín to write, of all people. And the first line of it struck me when I was thinking about through it again. The first line is, "I am the new flesh," which of course you've appropriated from Cronenberg, as you admit in the next line. Yeah. But it seems to me that it really encapsulates something really interesting that's going on in the book, which is that you were kind of consubstantial with the internet in a way. You are, as you go on to explain, you were born in 1989 in March, in the same month as the internet itself. And there's something quite uncanny about that, because it seems to me that you're, in a way that is subtly different to how so many people who write about technology and write about the internet write about it. You're writing about it from this really inside position. And the book is about that, I think. The book is about how the internet is in you and you are in the internet. And I just wondered if that's something you could say a little bit about.
Yeah, I really like that you picked up on it. I've always had a thing for horror. And actually, it's funny, but you may have experienced this yourself, but in the time since the book has come out, in the time since the book has come out, I've started to really think back on what has shaped my view of how I think the world, the way I write. And I actually think it goes back to reading Greek myths as a child, the idea of metamorphosis. That's always really kind of captured my attention. And then obviously later, when I'm slightly underage and trying to rent videos or DVDs out of Laser in Ranelagh, I was always around the horror shelf, and Cronenberg in particular, amazing, fascinates me. But there's something about that idea of body horror, of it being on you and part of you, that really strikes a chord with me and how I feel about the internet. It's this thing that's in us, that's running through our veins, and we're not quite sure how it got there, and we only realized when it was too late. And there are moments of kind of existential or just very physical as well, horror of get this out of me. I want my own feelings. I want to know myself again. And then other times where there's a kind of mutant elation to that same state, right? So it was coming from that. And obviously where I start the book is in 2016. That was when I was at my lowest, because I was in the grip of, I found out later, a personality disorder, but I was also in the grip of an internet disorder. And I think the whole world was a little bit that time. I think in that Patricia Lockwood book that's just come out, so she's kind of in my head lately because I'm doing an event with her, but she calls it internet poisoning. I think that was a year where we all suffered from that to a degree. And those who didn't even know or care about internet culture very much suddenly felt like they had to factor it into global politics.
It's interesting you say that, because it strikes me that, as I read this book, I recognize most of what you're talking about. I have a little bit of that myself, but it feels to me that you're writing about a condition that we all, or at least a lot of us, have, which is sort of extreme internet brain, or whatever you want to call it. But you seem to have it in a much more extreme and absolute way, I think it would be fair to say.
Yeah. Everything's more extreme with me, I suspect. I think also, though, it came from a loss of faith and kind of having my heart broken by the internet, because you can see a clear trajectory in my work. Sounds very self-absorbed. Just like imagining that my columns on like furries are going to be collected one day. But that's what I did every week for years on end. I wrote about internet culture, and I would always get that same response from people, be like, "Oh, you're so internety, lol." And like back in the day, it was cat videos or whatever, and then it was furries, and then it was Nazi furries, and then it was just Nazis, and they had no redeeming qualities whatsoever. No, I don't think there is redemption for furries, by the way. Anyway, just to get that clear. But I had been following that. I'd been following internet culture, for better or worse, for years on end, and it was only when it came down to writing the book that I actually pinpointed what about it that so attracted me. This idea of self-fashioning, which is so literary in so many ways, of writing a life for yourself and an identity on the internet. I mean, that is wonderful. And there's a part of me that completely agrees with the old kind of techno-utopian texts. And, it's fascinating. A lot of it's still online. That there is so much possibility there. There is something really dazzling and beautiful. But I think in the last half of the 2010s, we saw that go horribly astray. And we saw the corporate, and much earlier than that, like we saw the corporate takeover of the internet. And that happened so quickly, I think. And it was sold to us with the same claims that the techno-utopians were making.
Right. I mean, it's a very sad book in a lot of ways. I mean, it's really funny, and it's, very smart and thoughtful and everything. But for me, the sort of overriding effect when I'm reading it is a kind of a melancholy disappointment, I suppose. And there's so many things, there's, loneliness there, and there's all these kinds of things that you explore at length and in great detail and with great vividness. But it's very melancholy.
Yeah, it was intended as, I included that quote at the beginning from Bruce Sterling about dark euphoria. I was obsessed with that, just that line, but there are other things in that speech. Like he describes an era of Gothic high tech. But that idea of dark euphoria really, caught on in my imagination before I even knew what kind of book I was writing or whether I would write a book or not. And I think that's what we've been through. And we've kind of fallen for anything over the last 10 years. I didn't want to, define the book as taking stock of what's happened over the last decade, but in a sense that's there. And yes, it is a melancholy perspective. It is one of failure and lost promise and cancelled futures and a boring dystopia too. And I still feel like I'm in it now. It's all the more acute because I've talked about a process of recovery from the internet, from the kind of excessive work cultures, the self-loathing, the self-optimization, all of those things. I've tried my best to become aware of them and to, resist them, but it's a constant struggle. And that was why I didn't want to say in the book, delete your accounts. I don't think that's sensible advice to give to people. And I think it's mainly given by people who aren't of a generation who have had to have accounts to have careers.
Right. It feels like there's a trajectory in the book where you never get to that point where you're like, walking away, because I think the book is premised on this idea that there is no walking away. And that's what's interesting about how you approach this. But it feels as though you've reached, and maybe this is more a question for the end rather than now, but it feels as though you've reached some accommodation, some uneasy accommodation with, the internet and the world that it's made. Or is that too, it's tentative, right? It's not quite that settled.
No, I think you're right. I think there are kind of two sides to it. There's one which is educating myself. And I think as a broader culture, we're all in the process right now of educating ourselves to be skeptical of what technology sells us. And I think we've come a long way in a short amount of time. We've gone from a sort of reverence for these hoodie-wearing iconoclasts to now a skepticism and distrust and, investigating them as monopolies. And maybe some sort of legislative change is coming. And, things are going to change in the next decade. We will all be shifting to taking stock of what technology has done to our culture. And we already are doing that. And then on the personal side, it's a process of, for want of something less cliched, self-knowledge. It is. And I think some people are just more sensible and have that core and that resilience, and they're reasonable. I think there are so many people out there who are better qualified to be on the internet, I think it's comparable to addiction. You know, it really is. Like, some people can tolerate alcohol and some people can't. And I'm not sure I can tolerate very much internet. Um,
I mean, that's one of the things I wanted to ask you about, is that sort of addictive or obsessive side to the book, which is really where it gets like so fascinating for me, because it's as though even when you're not on the internet, you're on the internet. I mean, the parts of the book where you're not directly writing about, say, social media or, you know, the tech world per se, where you're writing about Monster Energy drinks or, you know, being in the gym at 2 a.m., there is something irreducibly internet about those things. And I was wondering, like, where is the division, or what is the relationship between your sort of obsessive experiencing self in those moments and your writing self? As in, you know, even when you're sort of like in the gym in the Docklands at 3 a.m. With your headphones on, are you thinking like, this sort of madness will make a great essay at some point? Are you already like working through that essay in your mind? Because I know for myself,
yeah.
you know, tamer versions of my own obsessiveness, there is always that kind of chink of, this will make something, you know, I'll be able to do something with this.
Yeah, it's like the solace and the hiding place of all writers who somehow, I don't know why, also always seem to end up in these ropey and crazy situations. I like how that, I feel like that voice is always there in your work, where, you know, there's that little voice checking in saying, well, at least it'll make a good essay. And it's like deadpan. I think for me, it's a mixture, because I have a history of developing very obsessive, like, problem behaviors, and not even knowing that that's what I'm doing. And I allude to that in the book. And in a sense, the book is a process of finding that out in itself. Like, holistically, the whole thing is that. But I actually don't know, because another big part of the process of the book was taking a step back and just the wonderment at the strangeness of life. I think there's no better example than Monster Energy. We see it every day. Like, we see the mark of its neon claws on culture, but it's just there in the fridge, and it's so casually strange. It's kind of surreal when I break it down. And then, you know, the body and this idea of biohacking, which I kind of get the sense has come and gone, although digital fitness and health tracking has actually flourished during the pandemic. So I guess it hasn't gone away. But the body as the intersection, and I guess the kind of vector of like all of these values. And then what that does in a kind of obsessive person, which is like me, panic attacks. I was really keen to explore that in the book. And I loved how the more research I did, the more I found that this isn't really anything new, that our bodies and our mental states are always in some way a result of the times we live in. And in the book, in the Monster Energy essay, I talk about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and the age of industrialization, and how then, you know, when you look at it, Mr. Hyde is kind of the perfect worker, because he doesn't sleep, he has limitless energy, and he's completely amoral. You know, like, what is the modern day equivalent to that? The person who doesn't sleep, and they take like a stack of nootropic drugs, and they are always optimized, they're always working, they've given up solid food. They drink Soylent instead. Kind of digressing on from myself now. Sorry, that writer thing.
Like,
but it was all about rooting it out in myself, you know?
Right. No, but I mean, that's what's so interesting, because the line between your own kind of obsessive, weird behavior is very blurry with like what the culture wants from you, you know? Like, it's quite easy to, and you write about this all the way through really beautifully, I think, and in not very explicit way, but I think it's there, the sense that your kind of craziness is the craziness of the culture, you know?
Yeah. I was so inspired by Mark Fisher. I think it's the opening of Ghosts of My Life. And, you know, I think in part, maybe it's a little bit sexist almost to admit this, but like, it was coming from a man, because I think we have so many emotional narratives by women already, especially in essay writing. And I kind of was aware that that's a saturated market. And I was always a little bit averse, actually. I guess because, you know, I started out very, very shy and self-conscious, and I'm slowly getting a bit better at all of that. But I was always a bit scared of writing about myself. And it was when I got like I'm sure you know the transformative potential of working with Brendan Barrington, and that really, like, it was like I'd been given permission to talk about myself when I wrote the Night Gym with him as the editor.
Mm.
And then I just started kind of thinking there are possibilities for this, and there are writers out there who are doing that balancing of the personal and something else really well. I think Leslie Jameson is a great example in the Empathy Exams. I think that's a kind of like era defining collection of essays. But yeah, once I got that confidence to write more about myself, I started to kind of evolve with thinking that maybe I am a result of everything around me. And I mean, there's personal history, there's myself, there's a lot that I didn't write about in the book, you know, that's gone into the life I've had. But at the same time, maybe I'm not that strange. You know, actually, there's so much strangeness around me, and we are being conditioned in so many ways. Yeah, what you said about being, you know, in some ways, the craziness of a time, I think I have a kind of acute relationship to that because I was anorexic for so long. And when you come out of anorexia, one of the big problems that you have to conquer is this idea that everyone wants you to be thin. Like,
Mm.
but everyone likes me this way. They're my friends now. So if I recover, they won't like me because I won't be the way they want me to be, which is absurd. It's utterly horrible. And, you know, you're just bullying yourself basically. But I think the same thing is true of the way that we're encouraged to work. And it's a dark joke because we'll never afford anywhere to live. We'll never afford a home. So like, what's the fucking point? But it is, you know, it's that constantly oh well, if I don't work, maybe I won't be as good as that person who's you know online, or if I don't like look a certain way, I won't, you know, we're constantly comparing ourselves to other people through social media. It is an engine of pain. I
Mm.
really believe that, you know, and I think they know. I think they have to know on some level.
Yeah, I think so. I think they must, I mean, because like that's the sort of fruit of what they've built.
Yeah.
Um, like I think it's really interesting how sort of uh, coolly dispassionate in a way you are in writing about these. And actually, the Leslie Jameson comparison was one that I was going to make myself because she does something quite similar, where she writes about these really quite painful, raw sort of areas of her life, and does it in not a clinical way, but you know, she pulls back and sort of looks at the bigger picture and gets sort of works these sort of much sort of broader kind of cultural strands in, and that's something you do in most of the essays in the book actually. So yeah, I think that's you know, that comparison is certainly not out of bounds at all. I mean, this question, I wanted to go back to this question of loneliness, I guess, because the essays seem to kind of emanate this sense of loneliness that I think we all feel from being online all the time. And I think you get to it gradually, and you kind of circle around it in the early part of the book, and then with the sort of diptych of pieces on online dating, Men Explain the Apocalypse to Me, parts 1 and 2. That for me really becomes the kind of the moment where loneliness becomes like reveals itself as not the subject, but a major subject of the book. And I just, yeah, wondered if you could say a little bit more about that, because it seems to me that it's not something that's been written about in that kind of personal way all that much or all that well. The sense that, you know, the whole premise of social media and online dating and all these technologies is that they bring us closer together, they connect us, and in sort of superficial and sometimes substantial ways they do, but for the most part there is this kind of, you know, hard to define sense of loneliness that comes from that connectedness.
Yeah, I think there was a rush to define it as friendship, as connection very early on, and it didn't. It was quite thoughtless, actually, because it's a different kind of connection. It's not that it's not always driving us further apart, but it's definitely not this wholesome, life fulfilling thing that, you know, is sold to us by social networks. And when I was writing the book, one thing I kind of brought in a lot, originally a lot more, but it got edited out, was if you go on YouTube, you can see these ads that Twitter and Google and Facebook have put out over the years. And their vision of life, of their ideal customer. And I mean, the best example is, but I get to finish it. Their vision of life is very strange, actually, when you take a step back and look at it. It's very limited. It's very wholesome. The best example, yeah, is the Facebook is like chairs, which some people might remember. But it was parodied on Silicon Valley as well, which is kind of genius, that TV show. But like, Facebook is like chairs. So I think their vision is that it's giving you a chair, and then the table is the community, and the people are all there, and they're on chairs of their own. But you know, is it connection? No, it's constant self-comparison, self-promotion. I don't want to moralize. I don't want to just say everyone is awful on the internet. I think some of them are, but it is bringing out very antisocial qualities in ourselves, and the loneliness, which is so stark and so obvious. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. It is at the heart of so many conflicts. Like in the book, I bring in incels, which I guess they don't really get as much airtime these days, even though the shootings are continuing and they're linked with the incels. I should also add that when I was writing Men Explain the Apocalypse, right in the middle of writing it, I found out that you were writing a book about the apocalypse.
Okay.
And
right.
I was freaked out. I remember saying to friends, I was like, "Will he think I'm copying him?" But yeah, with the dating chapter, and especially in the kind of the last days exegesis, the second apocalypse chapter, I go into these connections. But I mean, one thing I don't talk about in the book is I would suspect that QAnon, Trump, all of the other kind of weird things that have come out of that, Boogaloo Boys, all of these like social ills that have risen from the internet in the last, over the last decade, they all have their roots in loneliness too. They're people who feel ignored, and they're people who constantly see other people apparently doing better than them on the internet. And yeah, it's that mechanism. It's a foundational flaw in how all of these platforms work. And it's invisible, so it's impossible to show it, like experience. I wanted to provide actual proof, all anecdotal, of course, but I wanted to document that because I'm not seeing it being documented elsewhere. And I don't think people want to talk about it very much either. It was very odd, like publicizing the book by going out and telling all these like people on radio, I'm so lonely. But it's true, like we scroll alone. Obviously, that's what it is.
Yeah,
Róisín, oh, sorry, Mark.
Did someone come in? Yeah, Shaun. Yeah.
Could I just ask you a quick question as well? And this is probably for both of you could probably speak on this. Róisín, especially just because you brought up the dating chapters as well. There's almost like this kind of wave of like micro politics that seem to wash over from the internet into the kind of the dates that you discuss and talk about. And because you bring up loneliness there and those other kind of actors, is that the kind of larger politics and the kind of larger narratives around the world seem to kind of wash away into and be represented then through the dates that you've gone on. Is loneliness, or could you say loneliness is like an accelerator of that transmission? Is that why people flock to it?
Wait, what did you say? Is that why people
kind of want to represent these ideals and what they say, or is there more to it? Is it how it's advertised or sent around?
I think there are two factors behind that, and I don't want to be like completely universally critical of online politics because it is an educational tool, and for Ireland it's done really great things. In terms of like the last two referendums, and it has basically politicized an entire generation, for better or worse. But it has done a lot of good. But yeah, I do think it's intoxicating. It feels like you belong somewhere. Like my very first piece of journalism, that basically like my first proper piece of journalism, I wanted to do a PhD at Trinity actually, and I was doing an MA in writing. An MPhil rather, yeah. And I wrote this piece for Vice, which I know people will laugh at me and say, "Oh, Vice," but yeah, it was a big deal to me at the time, and it was about the Irish models, who at the time were in the Indo every week. There were these women in bikinis, like always selling really unlikely things, like promoting the Dairy Council, or something. And I wrote about it as this like misogynistic trope that had just endured for like a decade and was just strange and didn't need to. And what did it say about Ireland? And was it kind of out of date at this point? And it experienced so much success. Like I'm kind of bragging here, but I've never had a success like it since, to be honest. Like nothing more thoughtful and like long and kind of well planned out that I've written has ever actually reached as many people as that piece. And that was what convinced me to keep writing. And it also definitely sucked me into the world of Irish Twitter and Irish Twitter politics. And for a long time, I was really high on it. You know, it really it felt real, and it felt like belonging, and it felt like a place to talk about things that I hadn't been able to talk about before anywhere else. And that was, I think, what made it all the more painful when it started to really hurt me, like the neurosis and the kind of baggage of carrying it around with me every day, thinking like, oh, like I remember at my worst, it's gonna just make me sound completely insane. But around that time when I like attempted suicide, I remember going into a supermarket and standing for like maybe half an hour in front of coffee, thinking, if I buy that, am I evil? If I buy that, is that like cultural imperialism? If I buy that, will someone cancel me? Like it was truly insane. I'd become kind of obsessive compulsive about the morality that I was seeing every day on Twitter. And I think everyone was on there on edge. At the same time, why was I making life so hard for myself? I was interviewing people from like horrible parts of the internet because I thought in my head, I was like, I have to understand why this is happening, because I could see that it was growing and growing, and it did. It became really scary, the alt-right and all that stuff. It went from being such a kind of joke to being truly like damaging. But yeah, just that whole time things were so mixed up. So yeah, there's that sense of belonging, and then you're in and you've kind of sunk, you know, the sunk cost fallacy. Like you've put too much in and you can't leave, and your identity depends upon it. And then the other thing is a genuine motivation for wanting a better world. And if we're being told that technology is the tool with which we can create a world, we're being told that, like, or at least we were being told that. They've probably calmed down the messaging, but we were being told that the internet can change the world over and over at every turn. And it was like there in mainstream cinema even. And it was just out there. And they always use the Arab Spring as the example. Or like Zuckerberg claimed that he invented Facebook to give a voice to youth during the Iraq War. It's like, no, you didn't. But, you know, so I think it's that combination. Belonging, which is a totally human need, and we're being denied it in ways, and a lot of kind of common places have fallen away, in Dublin especially, and also just hope. I think it's misplaced, or for me at least, I would rather place my hope elsewhere.
I wanted to ask actually about that hope, because you know, it seems to me that the book is it's not completely devoid of hope, and like the last few chapters, there is like a really beautiful movement towards human connection and love, and you know, an investment in exactly what you're doing, which is writing, and you know, explaining the world to yourself and to others through writing. But I wondered where, like, if we could locate some of that hope in the internet itself. Do you think there is a future for the internet that is not completely inhuman, not completely alienating and alienated?
Yeah, I do. I'm kind of like, I feel like I'm kind of more acutely attuned to it these days, and I see it. Like I love the comments under like music mixes. I just see people like I play a lot of those late night lo-fi mixes, or the sound of rain. I have like a rain menu: rain in a cave, rain on a lake, rain on a cathedral window. And I play those long playing videos when I'm working late at night. And the comments under it are people just trying to kind of comfort each other. There's something like very sweet and very human. I also just look at a lot of dog pictures. But I think on a kind of corporate level, on the platform level, no, they have to be bullied into putting our fundamental needs, even acknowledging them. That's why I think people like Max Schrems are so important. You know, that you actually go to court and have the tenacity and just stubbornness, and you say, no, what you're doing isn't even legal, or what you're doing has a wanton disregard for the well-being of other people. And I actually think the way that they treat our data is at the heart of it all. Like if you treat people as data, and that data is used for profit, they're not humans to you anymore. You forget that what you're dealing in is actual, like the fabric of human life. And they are. I mean, they're, Facebook, 1/3 of the planet's population. These companies are having profound influences, and that's before we even get into the old think of the children argument. But that's very accurate too.
Yeah, I mean, this is a wonderful moment in the book that you just made me think about, which is the moment in, I think it's the first or the second dating essay, I can't remember, where you get your data from Bumble.
Oh yeah.
And it's just this like insanely reductive and, in some ways inaccurate version of yourself and your, life and interests and so on. But then you kind of realize, I am what the internet is made of. I am the kind of raw material. And that kind of, for me, links back to the first line of the book about being the new flesh. But there's something, I mean, it's so simple. Of course, that's the truth, but it's rare that you hear it expressed that sort of bluntly, actually. So yeah, and I think, I mean, I guess not to harp too much on the question of hope, but because it strikes me that and this is something I've experienced myself as a nonfiction writer, writing in sort of broadly the same ballpark. There is always a kind of a pressure, both external and externally, to inject some note of hope into these. I think you, like me, are writing about these things because they are a source of despair in a way, and you're trying to recuperate something, trying to like reclaim some humanity from this inhuman kind of world that you're writing about. And I guess that leads me into like one of the things I wanted to ask you about was Dublin comes across in this very actually realistic way that I'm not sure that I've seen it written about in quite this way. It seems like a very bleak, very unlivable place in your book. And I wonder how, like, do you have thoughts about where Dublin is going, whether it can become more livable? Where are you now in relation to where you were in the book in terms of the place where you come from?
I'm actually in Dublin right now. And they've got rid of the rent cap in Berlin. So sort of complicating my plans, along with the pandemic, of staying there. Yeah, I wanted to portray Dublin as a cyberpunk dystopia, although it doesn't really have the aesthetic markers outside of the docklands. I think it's funny because like over the last week, I've had this optimism about Dublin being out. I think everyone has, seeing things reopening again. But then when I actually boil down the experiences that I've gone and rushed to have now that lockdown is lifting, they're all entirely consumer based. They're getting my hair done and walking through Brown Thomas and looking at clothes I can't afford. And meanwhile, what was the news today? Like Chapters, is Chapters closing, or is it just they're closing part of Chapters? I mean, it just happens again, and it kind of feels like it's that like some leg that's full of wounds and they're just putting another knife in it, and you're like, you might as well add another, then go on, just like hurt me again. And someone online today was tweeting, I saw, about Accent's coffee shop. Like, I've missed coffee shops so much during the lockdown. I remember you tweeting about that you listen to the sounds of coffee shops, which is very relatable for me. That would actually help me. Yeah. But there's nothing left. I don't want to be that kind of, all or nothing nihilistic point of view, but I feel like I'm living a joke in Ireland. And I think and that's partly why right now I'm completely overworked. I can't stop accepting work because I'm just like, oh, well, what if I need money? Because, and in Berlin, I definitely didn't have that fear. It was lifted because I knew that not only could I afford to live there and rent there, and I actually started calling myself a writer there. I didn't feel any guilt about calling myself a writer when I lived in Berlin. But also, they placed an actual kind of, they prioritized quality of life above capital gain. I got the sense in Berlin. I think because they've just been through so many colossal mistakes in terms of how they run their city and their country. But, it was just very different. And yeah, in Dublin, it feels completely out of my hands. I will never, I think I remember hearing David McWilliams talking about how my generation is supposedly the one, like we're at an age where we're supposed to hold the most economic power and we own 1 to 3% of the property. Like, it's a joke. My existence is a joke in Ireland, to be nihilistic about it. Like, I can't contribute to the economy, nor do I particularly want to. And to have that temporary life, it filters into so many other aspects of life. It kind of permeates, you know, our relationships to each other. It affects how we think of ourselves as these stunted adolescents, basically. And it kind of gives you this like lovely shiny new version of the traditional Irish Catholic guilt, where you'll just never be enough. It's very negative. Sorry.
That's kind of what I wanted to hear. I mean, I wasn't really hoping, you know, I may have phrased the question in a way that sounded like I was looking for some glimmer of hope. Maybe I was actually, but that sort of.
There is one. You can leave. There is hope, and I think people are moving to the country and stuff. You know, I mean, people are starting to think, okay, what does a good life look like? And that plays into our use of technology too. I think I have this massive fear that, you know, I'll be on my deathbed and I'll be just thinking, I spent it all on the internet.
Yeah. I should ask if there are any like questions that have come in from the breakout groups, or whether there are any like comments that people want to make. If not, I can
jump into that, Mark, very quickly. There's an awful lot of stuff that we spoke about that has come up already kind of organically in the conversation, that sense of resonance. I realized I forgot to say this to you earlier, Róisín. Absolutely love the book, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
The sense of place and that kind of a little bit about techno solutionism. We talked about that slightly, and this kind of endless productivity, boring dystopia. But what I was interested in is, it can be a little bit about Dublin, or it can be a little bit about the future, or about the internet. But what do you guys think the future will look like 5-10 years? We're kind of in this culture shock moment right now. COVID has probably accelerated it somewhat, but what do you think it's going to look like in 5 or 10 years?
I was tempted to just let Róisín handle that, because it's a tough one. I mean, despite the fact that I have like written 2 books about the future, I have no confidence in my own ability to predict what might the future look like. I don't think it's going to be either a transhuman future or an apocalyptic future, which happen to be the 2 sort of subjects I wrote both of my books about. I mean, I guess it's probably going to be more like, you know, just more of the same, maybe slightly better. I don't, you know, at the beginning of COVID, I definitely, and this was a common sort of condition, I suppose, but I definitely felt that out of the catastrophe, some kind of change, maybe even radical change, might emerge. And I think what we've seen in the last, you know, 6-9 months is that does not seem to be happening. It feels like what had been happening slowly was, you know, the gradual kind of removal of so many aspects of cultural life, and just sort of people being present in places. Things were already becoming difficult for, you know, musicians and artists and writers and so on. And I think with COVID, technology has sort of colonized even more of those spaces much quicker. And I think, I hope that's a temporary situation. You know, things like this are great, obviously, and like it, you know, technology has saved our skins in a lot of ways over the last year. I mean, the fact that we can even do this now is like pretty amazing. But I think everyone is really keen to get back to like being in rooms and like, you know, watching plays with actors in the same space and stuff like that. I'm kind of rambling because I don't really know what the future is going to look like, other than a sense that it's probably going to be quite like the present, only maybe a bit worse. I don't know. And I always feel this pressure as like a sort of a broadly kind of left-wing person to inject a note of like revolutionary hope or something, but I don't really feel that right now. So it's hard to go there. But yeah, maybe Róisín would have more concrete things to say about the future.
Yeah, I mean, the guillotine.
Right.
No, I'm not one of those people. That's a joke. Yeah, I think it's going to take another 10 years to make sense of what the last 10 years have done to us. and a kind of education. And I think like it would be really interesting if, and I'm not saying I think this will definitely happen, but it could be very interesting if a kind of anti-consumerism movement sprung up, but for the internet. You know, where people like got really kind of sanctimonious about like Nestle and McDonald's and Nike. But what if they did it again, but for Google? And I think there are little like inklings that that might actually happen. But then what is the alternative? Is it a local kind of demonopolized version of what we have now? Is it that we all like the platforms like to talk about control, and you know, they're saying like, you can have control, but you have to read this vast terms and conditions document, and it's not actually practical. So, I mean, how do they, in a way, it's in their business, it's in their interest that we never take control because we don't understand it. I do think if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I would have thought that things like Facebook were so innately they were so integral to how businesses work, particularly, and advertising and the kind of the big networks sprung up around that, and even democracy now as well, like in a kind of sinister way. But those networks of data are so integral to just how other people do business, who really wouldn't in any other kind of circumstances want anything to do with Facebook, that it could never fall. But I kind of think it already has. You know, it's kind of disappeared. It's done this, Facebook has done this lovely disappearing act where it's faded into like the hedge, but it's making sure that you know that WhatsApp and Instagram are made by Facebook. And I mean, that's just for like my age group. I think for older people, especially like my parents' age group, they are now discovering Facebook. So it's done a kind of magical shape-shifting act, but I think that will probably continue. And right now, I mean, what people are saying is that the monopoly investigations are clearing the way for things like TikTok. But you know, TikTok will then become on the scale with Facebook potentially, and who knows what that will mean. I don't think we're about to let go of social media anytime soon, but we may develop a moral consciousness around it and start to treat it as the fast food of tech, you know?
I just actually wanted to ask you about, again, that sort of final note of the book where you talk about writing in this quite moving and almost earnest way, as this way of like connecting, and you know, you connected in that final moment with love, and I think there's something really interesting about that, because it seems to me that you're doing something that is in a way very old-fashioned. You know, you're an essayist, and that, like, obviously there's a certain modishness to being an essayist within the sort of tiny you know, world of like literary nonfiction that we both exist in. But at the same time, there's like this, you know, the two modes of communication, social media and the essay, could not be more at odds with one another. So it strikes me that you're doing something quite contradictory, is not the word, but there's a sort of a tension between those two things. It's very interesting to me.
That's really nice that you picked up on that. It's, yeah, I mean, I kind of set out with this idea that writing would be a place of resistance to social media, and specifically in ways of thinking, because, you know, something like Twitter, it's like caffeine, you know. I'm comparing everything to food. I have to stop. I think it's because I'm hungry.
You're hungry.
I'm gonna go and get some food after this. But you know, it's like jolt, 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 dopamine. Scroll, keep going, looking for the thing you don't know even what you're looking for, but you're looking. And the essay, from its like birth, was all about, well, processes, documenting your process of thought, and it's a long-term way of thinking. And I was just so kind of moved in a way by that idea in like Montaigne of I know nothing. It's the opposite of what you come to a platform like Twitter with, where you're there saying, you know, I'm a communist, so all my opinions will be communist. Which, okay, you know, fair play, but like also I actually don't feel like I know what I am, and I don't know if I have the answer. And I want to use this essay as an argument with myself, and as a way to delve into the world around me and myself, and think in a much bigger way than I think I'm allowed to on social media. And it was earnest. It's entirely earnest. I mean, what is going to redeem my life if not writing? I'm not sure anything else will.
Right. Well, I mean, it strikes me that you're not afraid of that. You're not afraid to be, I mean, earnest is like such a dirty word almost, but like you mentioned, Trisha Lockwood, who I think is like absolutely brilliant, but there's everything is like mediated through this like heavy machinery of irony, and that's not something that's there in your work. I mean, you it's not like you reject it, you use it when it's, you know, when it's useful, but you don't seem to be irony poisoned in the way that so many people who write about the internet are. You know, there is a willingness to be earnest and like straight down the line, and you know, to speak plainly.
I don't think I'm capable of anything other than that, actually. And that's not like me flattering myself, because for years and years, I labored under this idea that if you were literary, you had to be capable of perfect self-control and of that framing and that self-fashioning in real time, you know. And I'm not capable of that. I'm very haunted by the fact that I say things I regret later, like all the time. I just can't. Yeah, and I mean, I used this in an article I wrote, but it really is true. Do you ever watch videos of Freddie Mercury on stage? Sometimes when I need like moral sustenance, like I need my faith restored, I go and I watch Freddie Mercury performing live on YouTube, and you see someone who, even before he knew he was going to die, kind of knew he was a mortal creature, but that he could channel something immortal. Like I grew up singing, and when I go on stage, it was always that thinking of, I'm going to give it everything because I could just drop dead in a minute. I want to give it absolutely everything and say exactly what I mean. And I definitely wanted to do the same thing with writing. I wanted there to be humor too. I mean, there's sincerity without humor is kind of awful often. It was really important to me to be humane and humorous and not, you know, pretentious, basically. I know we shouldn't be afraid of being pretentious, but at the same time, it's not what I was going for at all. I can only write about things properly if I'm really, really passionate about them and absorbed in them. It's kind of a problem because right now all I care about is science fiction novels, and I don't even know what to do with it. But yeah, that lights up writing. That's the only thing that makes me capable of actually getting the thing done. And it's also what drives the curiosity behind an essay.
I mean, you write about writing as a form of freedom, as something that allows you to, you know, take and experience freedom. And I mean, you kind of have alluded to what your interests are now, but I'm curious, of course, as anyone who has read the book will be, where is that freedom taking you now, or where do you hope it to take you in terms of your writing or otherwise?
There are a few things I really want to, but like lately I just don't have time for anything, and it's all quite kind of not literary work. It's really depressing me, honestly. But I am in the middle of, I haven't even formally like told my agent or anything. I'm like quite far into a novel. And I don't know, we'll see where it goes. I would happily write another book of essays too. I have all these things that I'm so curious about. They're sort of tech adjacent, but they're not tech. And the opportunities are kind of starting to open up to do them. But some of them would be bigger projects than, this all sounds very vague. The next thing I do, I don't want it to be as much grounded in myself. I want it to be looking outward. And that will be a kind of post-COVID way of writing, I think. I'm tired of being, you know, retreating inward and introspection. I really want to just go out into the world.
Do you find that that's a sort of a self-limiting kind of process, like drawing on your own life? Do you feel that there's a lower level that you can't, you know, there's only a certain amount you can draw on?
Yeah, it's weird. I mean, I don't think I could ever write anything purely about myself. I don't know, it's interesting talking to you about this because I think you have that same balance and like layers of self-awareness, even about the act of writing itself. And I think that's what gives what you're writing a lot of tension, you know, and it's really enjoyable. I think personally, and it's probably just some self-loathing on some level, but I could never be one of those purely kind of personal essayists. It just doesn't interest me at all. And it's not how I live either. And that's not me saying like, oh, I'm not selfish. I'm probably the most egomaniacal person I know, like all writers are. Right. But at the same time, how I see myself is in relation to the world. and the two are symbiotic, and I'll never understand the world if I don't understand myself, and I'll never understand myself if I don't understand the world. And I'm definitely a thwarted well, I'm not, I was going to say I'm a thwarted economist, but like my dad's an economist and my brother is too. And the fact that they have the head for numbers and they can think about systems and unravel everything, you know, and just take an object and branch out, like, this is how this was made. And this is how these forces were at play when this was produced. And the economy was this. Like, I don't have that brain, but I do have that curiosity. And I'd like to use my writing to go straight in on subjects I have no understanding of whatsoever. I think I write best about things where I'm an outsider, and that's definitely how it happened with tech.
I mean, it strikes me though that there's, and this is something I really identify with myself. I can see that what you're doing is, in a way, you know, I recognize it, because what you're doing, I think, is you are writing about yourself and you are writing about the outside world, but you're using yourself to understand the outside world, and you're looking in the outside world for things that help you to explain yourself to yourself. And I think that's like a technique or a methodology or a sensibility that is as old as the essay. I mean, it's certainly something Montaigne was doing.
Yeah, and I think it's in, like, when I was reading your Apocalypse book, it's like, you know, at the beginning I'm kind of like, strange obsession, strange obsession, and then it's like it bears itself out as it goes. Yeah, this is here, and it's woven into so many different aspects of life. And like, the more, and I don't know, do you get this, but usually there's a real arc to how I write an essay, and when I'm really like deep into it, it's all I can talk about. I get so obsessed, and I think it's when I'm happiest too, because since the book came out, it hasn't been as rewarding as I expected it would be. I don't know, it just hasn't really felt like anything. I heard Lisa McInerney say the same thing about her book coming out last week, or it was a few days ago, but she was saying it doesn't really feel like anything, and that's disturbing, because it's not real.
It's like, it's hard for it. I mean, it's a weird thing at the best of times, but it is hard for it to feel like something now because of COVID. And like, you know, 2 years ago, you would have had a big book launch and you would have gone to festivals in person and stuff like that. And presumably there will be things like that on the horizon quite soon. But right now, it probably feels abstract. I know it did for me.
Yeah.
Like everything, you know, technology, software has eaten the world, you know, and it's eaten the book launch and the book event as well.
My book launch, it was so funny. Like, it was just me and Rob, who for others is my boyfriend, and like just sitting at the computer in his house in Wexford with him topping up my drink every so often. Then after the event, I only had like 2 or 3 drinks, but the adrenaline and the nerves, it just really got the better of me. And we went on Zoom to our friends in Berlin, and I just passed out on the sofa. Just fell asleep at my own, basically the digital book launch equivalent of like falling asleep in a pub. Like, it was so unglamorous, the whole thing. Maybe I'll get some kind of you know, proper book launch at some point. Maybe it'll be the next book. I hope so.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, like, in the meantime, this has been really interesting for me, and I hope it's been half as interesting for everyone else. I don't think we have any more questions from.
There's one in the chat. Thank you all, by the way, and thank you, Mark.
I don't see it.
Oh yeah, it's just a reference to the time.
My group has a bit of a question as well, if we do have the time, and it was very simple. It was just, was there anything, Róisín, that you wanted to include in the book, other essays or other areas that you delved into that you didn't or may want to include in the future?
I don't know, when I think about it. I'm very interested in the history of technology. I'm interested in figures, like interesting kind of templates of, okay, don't judge me, tech masculinity, and how that came to be, and the people who diverge from that too. Like, at the very end of the book, I talk about Douglas Engelbart, and I mean, he is so interesting to me. And that tape, it really did strike me as this kind of biblical moment. And people like, I don't know, as anyone like Ted Nelson of Project Xanadu, who strikes me as the real life Rick from Rick and Morty, and who tapes every aspect of his life, but he's like 80 something now. I'd love to interview him so much. And people like the OG your problematic fave, John McAfee, if anyone's seen the documentary Gringo on the life of McAfee, I mean, there is a template for tech masculinity at its most horrifying, like honestly horrifying, but just, yeah, all of these people, these kind of the hideous men of technology, and some of the good men too, but that aspect of just kind of people in technology, and the kind of ones who don't get as much attention as well. That's not McAfee, by the way. There are others. So yeah, something like that would be really of interest to me, and I'd like to write more on. It's funny because the book actually started as completely different, and it was very much about like internet communities and identity, the issue of identity in the internet, which ended up there in the end, but in a very different way. I at the beginning, I convinced myself I was going to write about all these horrible parts of the internet. So I spent a lot of time on 4chan and other kind of horrible spin-off sites that, and I was writing about things like pro-Anna communities and Munchausen's by internet and very morbid stuff. And I was very depressed at the time. And I'm glad I didn't end up going with that, because I think I would have just gone insane. And also, I don't think anyone would enjoy reading that.
Okay, do we have any more questions, or I actually can't see the questions here.
Oh yeah?
I'm probably doing something really basic, wrong and stupid, but I don't see
No.
I might just have one more question, if that's okay, as a selfish question, if I can. And it's to do with, you mentioned that Mark Fisher kind of confirmed your suspicions about how strange and dangerous the world is. And as like a younger person reading this book, it was a way that in college and growing up, you kind of have these existential areas of dread, and you put it really nicely into words, the things that I know myself and some of my friends could never explain when we were like in college and stuff. So that was super nice. Do you, like, and Mark, you might be able to speak to this as well. Do you have this anxiety and kind of existential worry that a lot of young people have, especially growing up in Dublin today? Do you have any tips or anything that you think can help young people in navigating this type of world?
Shall I go?
Please do.
Okay. I have two suggestions, although I am not a doctor. Just in case you had any suspicion I might be a medical doctor. I would, if I were like going back and doing it again and could go back and do it again, I would have saved up and done therapy much earlier, specifically CBT. And it's so inaccessible. Like, I've been trying to get back to it now, and I'm having real problems even getting on people's lists. I think because the pandemic has driven a surge. But I think that's a really invaluable thing, and it's really good for unlearning the sort of habits that your brain has developed without you even knowing. And it definitely helped me take that step back and gain perspective on technology and on my life and on these things I was doing that just were not helping me at all. And the other thing I think is that I think we're all a bit disembodied. We're all like dissociating a little from our bodies, and the internet does that. And some of us are more prone to it than others. But for me, I do yoga every day, or I try to do yoga every day, because I'm not very good at meditation. My mind is just too like, so yoga is good because it forces you into a sort of moving meditation. But anything like that can have that effect, even if it's just going for a walk, but really reclaiming, grounding yourself in your body, and being comfortable there. And it's totally achievable. I think the internet makes me profoundly uncomfortable. I get those moments like, it's like that song lyric, how strange it is to be anything at all. You know, a horrible kind of strange shock at just living. I still haven't got over the shock of being born, you know, like that feeling. And it then leads on to dread, anxiety, spiraling, fears about the future, which are in so many ways valid. But the thing you can do, I think, is reclaim your own presence in the world. And a lot of that, the internet really corrodes that. So you have to I think we all have to make special effort to claim that back.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and absolutely all of it, including therapy and all that stuff. I mean, it's really hard to talk about this kind of thing without seeming like really corny actually, and some of the most like, sorry, that's my dog, which is a
dog tax. Dog tax.
You want to see the dog? She's been, I don't know if you've noticed, but I've been like throwing a little toy for her to keep her quiet. Number one would be get a dog. Can you see? There she is, Sally.
She's beautiful.
Yeah. But I'm just going to be holding a dog now as I say this, if that's okay. I think, and this like sounds really like cornily kind of earnest, but the thing for me, and this is like something I wrote about in my last book, Notes from the Apocalypse, it's just like, and even as I say it, it sounds embarrassing, but just like spending time in nature. It's like the antidote to all of the things we've been talking about, in a way that's probably already been talked about ad nauseum by tech people, you know, who are of course, you know, just as much kind of pro going out into nature as anyone else. But yeah, I did this thing where I spent, and I've done it like 3 or 4 times now, where I've just gone out by myself into like a relatively wild kind of area and just sat there for like 24 hours. And it is the most kind of subtly kind of mind altering experience I've ever had. And it's like the times that I've done it, it's stayed with me, and it's like been a real sort of salve for the soul. And yeah, just so like a profoundly kind of beautiful and strange experience, but like really connects you to the strangeness of being alive, as you would say, you know, and but in a really good and sort of yeah, transformative way. So
your essay on that is, I love how it like documents the process and the kind of uneasiness that you have at the beginning.
Yeah, it's hard, like it's difficult. It's a bit like meditation. It's, you know, you have to work through boredom and like, you know, irritation with yourself and like, what am I doing sitting under a tree in the middle of nowhere? But you know, time, if you take time for things like that, they can really kind of pay off and become yeah, profound. I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm holding a small dog, as I say, that's some kind of lunatic or Bond villain.
Brilliant. We might wrap up there shortly. That's been so interesting though. And I totally agree with some of the points that you brought up, especially towards the end. And I'm not trying to plug in a promotional piece here, but we are doing an episode of our podcast series on the importance of getting outdoors, especially during the pandemic, and it will go live next week. So I think some of the stuff you just touched upon, even like pets and like, of course, getting outdoors, yoga, meditation, all of those things are so important at the minute. But it has been fantastic to have you all here. Both, of course, Róisín, of course, thank you so much.
Thank
really
you.
really interesting. And Mark, of course, thanks so much for moderating tonight. Niamh and Shaun, thanks so much for facilitating the roundtable or the breakout sessions. And of course, to everybody in the audience, I was going to say, we're not in the Packer Theatre, but everybody in the virtual audience. Thanks so much for tuning in. It's great that everybody stayed on after work and until this late, because I know everybody has dinners and everything to eat. But of course, yeah, really appreciate you being here. And Niamh, our head of communications, has just shared a survey for you all to fill out, but it's also been emailed to your personal accounts if you registered for a ticket. So please do fill it out if you have a couple of minutes, so that it can help us to improve our events moving forward. Brilliant. Have a lovely evening, and thanks a million again.